Hi, my name is Rithi. I'm a junior at AU and I am the president of Her Campus American. And I'm just going to kick things off by introducing our wonderful journalists and speakers who have joined us today. So thank you for being here. And I'm going to start with Professor Amy Eisemann, who is a veteran journalist, educator, and editor. And she's the director of the journalism division at AU School of Communication, where she teaches reporting, ethics, and digital content. Previously, she led the MA in Interactive Journalism, the MA in Media Entrepreneurship, and the Writing for Communication programs in SOC. She also co-ran a school project on the intersection of games and journalism. In 2015, she was named among the 100 Tech Titans in Digital Washington by Washingtonian magazine. Eisman was an editor with Gannett for 17 years, first as a cover story editor at USA Today, and later as an executive editor of USA Weekend. She was also a managing editor at AOL. Her early career involves reporting and editing stints at newspapers in the DC suburbs, Baltimore, and Dallas. Her reporting focused on the people in the news. During the so-called Iran hostage crisis in 1979-1980, she moved in for several nights with one of the families in the US, getting the story from their lens. Driven by curiosity about people's lives and motivations, she was drawn to interview criminals as she was celebrities, politicians, and the President of the United States. I'm going to kick things off to Hannah to let her introduce Professor Mathur.
Hi, Professor Mathur is a senior professor electoral at AU and a deputy managing editor at Bloomberg. An alumni of AU's School of Communication, she has been a journalist in the Washington, D.C. area for more than 30 years, serving as a congressional correspondent for 6 years, covering federal food policy and budget and tax issues, as well as federal agencies such as the FDA, Treasury, IRS, and Department of Agriculture. She started out her career in journalism as an editor at McGraw-Hill Publications, focusing on the nuclear power industry, and later became a congressional correspondent for ABC Capital Cities Publications and for the Bureau of National Affairs, which is now Bloomberg Industry Group. After a brief stint as an editor at Kiplinger Publications, she worked for several years as an editor for the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group, specializing in private sector development issues. She is now back at Bloomberg Industry Group, where she is a deputy managing editor for international tax and accounting issues. She also serves on a 3-member panel for the Bloomberg News Division's Diversity Committee, which spearheads efforts to make the newsroom a more diverse and inclusive workplace. So thank you, Professor Mathur, for being here, and I'm going to throw it to Gracie to introduce Professor Hall.
Thank you, Hannah. I'll be introducing Professor Hall. Professor Hall is an associate professor in the School of Communication at American University in Washington, D.C., and specializes in researching, writing, and teaching about the intersection of media and politics in journalism. Before joining American University, Hall was a journalist covering the news media, politics, and policy for national publications, including 9 years as the media correspondent for the Los Angeles Times in New York. She was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and she's the author of an upcoming book on politics and the media. Hall is a moderator and executive producer for the long-running American Forum events series at American University, interviewing prominent journalists and politicians with students on TV, public radio, and online. She has worked with KPU on many events, and she has twice been chosen Professor of the Year by American University Student Government. Professor Hall has been a regular contributor to Columbia Journalism Review, the Harvard International Journal of Press and Politics, and the Freedom Forum Media Studies Journal, and she has written for other publications from Rolling Stone to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. She is frequently interviewed about issues in media and politics by the New York Times, Washington Post, AP, NPR, Politico, and numerous other outlets. A former media commentator at Fox News Channel, she has regularly appeared as a media expert on CNN's media analysis program, Reliable Sources, as well as PBS NewsHour, MSNBC, C-SPAN TV, and other networks. And now I'll pass it over to Isabel to introduce Professor Foster.
Thank you, Gracie. So I'm going to introduce Professor Bobbie Foster. So Bobbie Foster is a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland in the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. She has studied internet memes, which, side note, I think is the coolest thing ever, for a decade, starting with Facebook memes shared during the 2012 presidential election. Her research is interdisciplinary in nature and takes a critical cultural approach to understand the many layers of communication within internet memes. Professor Foster has also contributed to projects related to media literacy along with disinformation and misinformation. She has taught courses ranging from topics in media literacy to journalism history. She has also designed and taught curricula in media ethics, foundations of news writing, and AP style, and women in media. Professor Foster has also organized development workshops for international and regional students and media professionals on a variety of topics, including trauma and journalism, diversity in media, and defending democracy from propaganda and disinformation. I'm going to pass it over to Devin.
Hi, guys. So I'm really excited to introduce Professor Merrillee Cox. She is a longtime broadcast journalist and lecturer at the University of Maryland. She has reported for ABC News for over 20 years, serving as their radio's general manager and Washington bureau chief for 5 years. Professor Cox was also the bureau chief at the United Press International Radio in Washington. And during her time at ABC News and UPI, she covered events such as the war in Iraq, numerous US elections, the Olympics, and the US Space Shuttle program. In 2001, Professor Cox, along with others at ABC, received the Peabody Award for their coverage of 9/11. She also received the Radio Television News Directors Association Edward R. Murrow Award in various categories throughout her career, including overall excellence, breaking and spot news coverage, feature and sports reporting, and newscasts and news series. In 2014, Professor Cox received her PhD from the University of Maryland in journalism and public communications. During that time, she was also the executive director of the Society for Futures Journalism. Professor Cox received her bachelor's degree in political science from American University and her master's degree in radio and television from Syracuse University. She was also a Scripps Howard doctoral fellow. Professor Cox now teaches journalism, history, and writing and reporting fundamentals at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. She has also taught journalism ethics, radio broadcasting, and audio, photo, and broadcast fundamentals. Recently, Professor Cox was part of 2 grant teams that worked over the summer to redesign 2 journalism classes for virtual learning in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. When she's not working, Professor Cox makes sure to keep up with her daughter, son, and 3 granddaughters, as well as take care of her 3 grand cats. So now that we've introduced all the professors, we are going to get started with a mediated Q&A, and then we'll have time at the end of the session for audience questions.
So thank you again to all of our professors for being here. We have a series of 5 questions that we're going to be asking, and we're going to allow time for all of our professors to answer. If a professor comments on something and another professor wants to chime in, please feel free, and I'll be mediating back and forth between. So the first question we wanted to ask is, why did you become a journalist? Professor Foster, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. I always kind of had an interest in journalism, but I started off as a music major, so I'm kind of a classic change your major your freshman year case. I discovered that music classes took something that I really loved doing for fun and made it work. And I was really kind of, at the time, getting particularly really interested in the 2008 election and following the news very closely with that. So it kind of became an intersection of my interest in politics and my interest in current events that kind of made me move into journalism with the goal of covering politics or covering really interesting stories. So that was kind of what got me started into it, was just really an interest around politics and the election. And being in journalism seemed like the best way to get the information first.
Sure. Thank you. Professor Cox?
My entry into journalism was almost an accident. I didn't have that in mind when I began my education at American. I wanted to be a diplomat, and then I wanted to be a lawyer, and then I didn't know what I wanted to be. So I just proceeded apace and did the best I could until all of a sudden I came across an Intro to Communications course, and that essentially led to my continuing pursuit. I delayed my decision-making by going to get my master's. That was really the basic reason. I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I stayed in school. And that was all it took. My arrival in Syracuse was not an accident, but it was a matter of taking care of the circumstance that I found myself in. I needed part-time work to finance my education. So I got 3 part-time jobs, including one in a local radio station doing news. And that was the trigger that set me on my path.
Thank you. Professor Hall?
Oh, I remember when I first started telling students about my career, at the end of it, I had not done that, and Professor Lynn Perry, a colleague of ours, had dubbed something Life 101. She thought we should be doing a little Life 101. And the students said, "Wow, that's so random, Professor Hall." I think people think we start out absolutely knowing what we're going to do. I was very interested in storytelling and in writing, more on the creative writing standpoint. And I went to college in California and came back to Texas and got interested in journalism by working on the Daily Texan, which was a newspaper for a student body of 42,000 students. So I covered the Austin City Council, and it was quite a beat, and I continued to write for the literary magazine, but I was very drawn to politics and media. I'd grown up in a family where we talked a lot about issues in the news, and I was just drawn to that. Went to Columbia J School, felt completely unnurtured, unloved, unlike the way I try to be and we try to be at AU, and I'm sure Maryland. But I got interested in covering the news about the news. And that has really been something that I love doing, is media ethics and talking to people. Getting to expose some of the practices that I thought were pretty terrible at the time at the network news divisions. So I started out as a creative person in writing, and then got more and more interested in journalism from that.
Thank you. Professor Eisman?
Well, like everybody, I bet a lot of people here did what I did. When you were a kid, did you have a family newspaper and it was named after your family, or how many people had a family newspaper?
I was editor of the middle school newspaper.
Mine was the Eismanian. Ridiculous as that is, I probably timed how long my mother sat on the telephone and wrote it down. But I really wasn't going to be a journalist. I studied urban planning, and when I went to University of Pennsylvania, I was I guess it's called city planning now, or urban studies, but this was urban planning. And I thought, what's a good way to learn about the city? And I went and got myself an internship at Philadelphia Magazine. And that was it. The world opened up. I thought, wow, you could talk to anybody, ask them anything, figure out how all it works. I was just sold from that moment on. And then I came actually to graduate school at American University. Really lucky that I made that move. And I think from my perspective, I was driven by curiosity. What a great opportunity to dive into all these different lives. Gracie, you're saying it too. It's just, you can just visit worlds that you've never been in. And the worlds might be next door. They might be down the street, or they might be in somebody's head, or they might be in somebody's book, or they might be anywhere. What a fabulous opportunity. People like Jane and Merrillee and other people on this call would, really could get themselves up into the big national events. I really started out in local news for a long time, and I have my heart really actually in a lot of local news, and I hope that it has a comeback again. But I did start in urban planning, and made my switch when I went to graduate school.
Thank you. I'm now disappointed that my family didn't have a family newspaper. So, thank you. Professor Mathur?
I didn't have a family newspaper either, but Amy, my comments are pretty close to yours, except that I first started college with a complete determination to become a doctor, like a good Indian child. I wanted to, everybody's nodding. I didn't want to disappoint my parents, because I was in pre-med. I was taking chemistry and biology, but at the same time, I was also taking journalism classes. I started working for the newspaper, and in my second year of college, I was covering stories, and I thought, I never looked back after that. I dropped pre-med, and I said, this is it. This is my passion. I want to be a journalist. And it was a wonderful experience. I thought, just like Amy, which is such a great opportunity to step into other people's lives and to really, enter their world, and to talk about issues that concern them, and to feel really inspired, and to be able to sort of, write their stories. And this is something that I think is not true for many other professions. You know, you pretty much are in your own world, in your own sphere of friends, friends. You don't really get to go out beyond that circle. And so I just thought it was a great opportunity. And I also didn't want to be, chained to my desk from 9 to 5. I wanted to be able to travel. So I love that idea about being a journalist. And what really sparked my interest in journalism in college was my first assignment working for the newspaper. The university that I attended was going through this horrible period of budget cuts and laying off staff and cutting departments and resources, and this was a terrible time. And one of the deepest cuts were in the African Studies department. And so I was asked to cover that story. A lot of students were protesting, whole day protest plan. And so I had a great time talking to them. But I also had a chance to talk to the chairwoman of this African Studies department. And she was passionate about what she taught. And she talked about how important it was for her to have this department and her mission and her goals. And so I really thought, wow, no, this is something I would never have been able to talk about with a person had I not chosen this field. And so I just loved covering that story. And I thought from that day on, I just thought, this is what I want to do. And here I am, not a doctor, but a journalist.
Thank you, Professor Mathur, and thank you all for sharing. I'm sure a lot of the students on this call can relate to a couple of the reasons and ideas why to become a journalist. The second question we wanted to move into is, what are some of the obstacles that you may have faced as a woman in the journalism field, and how have you overcome them? Professor Eisman, would you like to start?
I'm going to be terribly honest with you. I was very lucky that I had very progressive and editors. My first editor was a woman, which was unusual in a small newspaper here in Montgomery County, Maryland. And then I went to a newsroom in Baltimore, the Baltimore News American, where I also had editors that really understood what was going on. But I think for some of us who are older, and I can't speak for anybody else, we were in such different times than you guys. Things that were just part of our lives were things that you would never, nor should you, put up with. I told Riddy that when I left the Baltimore News American to go to the Dallas Times Herald, they gave me a party in the newsroom. And for some reason, someone thought it was a good idea to hire a male stripper to come in to say goodbye. Now, that's how it was. And I'm not accepting it. I don't like it. But just to give you a context, another time I was covering a crime story in Baltimore. He didn't take everything off, so we'll be okay there. I was covering a crime story in Baltimore, and there had been a murder at a bar, and I went down to the bar to kind of talk to everybody about what was going on. And I didn't know that the male editors sent a male reporter behind me to make sure that I was okay. I didn't really care for that. I didn't actually really know about it until I got back to the newsroom. Were things different for me because I was a woman? No, I was lucky. They got more different as I got older and I became an older woman. And I would say that in my career, those were the more challenging times for me in the news business.
And would you say that a significant portion of maybe female journalists today could still say that they've been as lucky, or do you think that maybe your experiences aren't as common?
I think female journalists today, because of the internet, have a terrible, terrible road to walk. I mean, I think that the fact that there's trolling, it adds a whole layer that I didn't have to deal with when I was a journalist. There's so many things that happen, the freedom that people have to say things. Some news organizations, and I think this is really interesting, I think Politico is doing it, have taken off the places, the addresses so that people can't write to the reporters that have written stories, to kind of cut down on the trolling. And I don't want to be quoted, but I think it was Politico that did that a little bit after some of the Me Too movement came along. But no, I think the challenges for women in newsrooms today are harder.
Sure. Thank you for your input. Professor Cox?
What Amy's talking about parallels some of my experience. I'm old. I was in a newsroom first many years ago, and my early days in the newsroom were as usually the only woman in the room. I will echo Amy's comment that she was lucky. I was lucky because I really shouldn't have been in a lot of the early places where I was when I first started working, because the truth is, I was an overachiever who wasn't really ready for what I was assigned to and able to do. But I was very self-confident and I was very committed to being a journalist. And so I stopped at nothing. Like a lot of other women who have worked over the years in newsrooms of whatever description, you show up early, you stay late, you work harder than anybody else in the room to prove to the men, mostly, who are around you, that you can do the job. I didn't have lots of overt difficulties. But again, what Amy said is so absolutely true. Young women today in newsrooms are dealing with so much more. The whole universe of journalism has turned upside down in some of our lifetimes. And so we have to adjust and adapt. I still have letters that were written to me early in my working lifetime complaining about something that I did, but they were complaining about, they didn't like the way I sounded. They didn't like the approach that I took to covering a story. They weren't trolling me. They weren't doing the nasty things that happen to women today. And for God's sake, I saved these letters. You know, I'm not a hoarder, but I do save certain things that allow me to look back on, you know, previous times and reflect and sometimes laugh about those days. But it's a whole world, new world for the young women who are on the call today, who are looking ahead to a career in journalism, presumably.
Sure. Thank you, Professor. Professor Mathur?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with these comments that women today, young women journalists today are do have a harder time in many ways. They're certainly more in physical danger covering, you know, certain issues that, you know, I think that's a disturbing trend. And so I agree with the previous comments. I started reporting in the early 80s. And so at that time, I did run across many women who kind of paved the way for me and who were mentors for me. And so I, you know, that's how I built up my confidence. I learned a lot along the way, just by knowing these women. But a couple of obstacles that I could mention here is that my first few jobs, I was immediately put in the department covering women's issues. And so, you know, the first paper that I worked for, it happened to be a national Indian newspaper that was an English language newspaper. And I literally actually just walked off the streets with my resume and said, I'm looking for a job. You know, I'd like to do some reporting. And the editor just took one look at me and said, well, you can actually edit these matrimonial ads that come in. And these are like, you know, current Tinder, date Tinder notes. But in fact, that's what I did. I sat in a room and I edited matrimonial ads. And many times I insisted that I cover, you know, actual news events. And so he would send me to cover musical performances, other social gatherings. You know, I did book reviews, I did all that. So And here I had a bachelor's, in journalism and political science. And so even then, that was one thing I thought was an obstacle. And my earlier jobs covering Capitol Hill, I know that my editors often worried that as a woman and as a minority, could I be tough enough? Could I be aggressive and going after stories? Could I chase after these men? Most members of Congress were white males, and so that was kind of a concern. And covering issues on Capitol Hill, I found that a lot of members of Congress looked at women reporters and didn't really take them seriously. I mean, we had comments, on your hair, your eyes, your clothes, and very patronizing ways of dealing with women reporters. So we had all of that, and I think that that was an obstacle, But as Amy has said, and Heather, that we actually, that inspired me to become, to sort of fight that even more, to say, all right, I think I will have to try harder. I will have to prove myself and stay longer and know the issues and, and chase after, like literally chase after members of Congress and be the first to get a story. So yeah, these are just a couple of obstacles that I think, were there for me in the 80s.
And you had mentioned that sometimes female journalists would receive comments on their hair, the ways that they dressed. How would you suggest, or what advice would you give for people to overcome those obstacles?
I think if it's in a public place, like I'll give you an example of a colleague of mine we were standing in a gaggle of reporters, and she was asking a question, and the member of Congress, patted her on the back and said, well, these are not really important issues. What I'm talking about is this. And so he deflected. And so what she did was she followed him. She went to his office and said, I'd really like to get an answer to this issue. So she didn't know how to deal with the patting on the back and the comments, but she did know that she wanted to get her story. And so she went and she persisted. And it turns out that the congressman actually didn't know the answer to her question and, said, here, you can talk to my legislative assistant. And so she did, and she got a wonderful story and many scoops after that. So you should be persistent when you have, something like that happen to you. But when it's an actual, somebody commenting on hair or eyes, or even touching, I think that's, that's troubling. And I think that we know about these issues more today, and we have more resources. Women have more resources, no places to go and complain and talk about it with their bosses. And these things are not just swept under the rug anymore. So you have that. I think you can definitely talk about these issues more than we were able to back then. I'm afraid many times we just laughed it off, but still went after the story. So I think you guys are lucky today that, these issues are out there. Everybody knows they exist.
Sure. Thank you. Professor Foster?
So my challenges were kind of two different challenges. One was generational, and I think the other one was more other personal identifiers. I'm probably the last generation of print news kids, because I decided to study print news in 2008. And the local news market was just collapsing in on itself. And I'm from Arkansas, so even more so. We went from having a competitive news market, and by the time I graduated, we just had one newspaper servicing the whole state. And that was a consolidation of two newspapers that were competitors. So the editing system there was a little bit tense, if you could say that for the least, because they went from being competitors to being together. So I mostly worked in a gig economy, doing freelance when I finished my undergraduate degree, and while I was doing my master's degree, because I decided to jump straight into a master's to wait out the bad economy, and then maybe in a couple of years after I finished my master's, things would be a little more stable. So I never really got a chance to be in a newsroom. Most of my interactions were over coffee with an editor or over emails with people. And a lot of my reporting fell in, like a lot of the stories I got were entertainment stories, because they didn't want to hand a freelancer something as important as City Hall, right? So most of the stuff that I was able to get was much more in kind of the quote unquote soft news, entertainment news things. The other challenge that I kind of encountered was, as somebody who identifies as a queer woman, I'm bisexual. I was early on warned against who I spent my time with outside of the newsroom because it might reflect a bias in my reporting. So I think while the professor who told me that was intending to tell me something like good, like he thought it was good advice, in a small sort of community that was Northwest Arkansas, there's not a lot of out people, and the people who are out spend a lot of time together. And so, yeah, it was not uncommon for me to be in a room full of, LGBTQIA activists as well, and be talking to them on a regular basis. I had no intentions of ever covering those stories, but it was always interesting to me that that was something that would come up as a potential bias in my reporting just in general, whereas my other colleagues didn't experience the same, judgments on what they were doing, what churches they attended, what their after work activities were not going to reflect a bias. But, me being as part of a marginalized community, especially in a red state, that was somehow going to reflect a bias in my reporting. So that was definitely a challenge that I'm still trying to figure out. I did have a lot of friends, the internet's been mentioned before. I did have a couple of friends who were pushed out of games journalism because they were doing gaming journalism and Gamergate happened and they were just tired of the trolling and of the mess. So they just quit journalism altogether. So I think there's definitely a lot of challenges with burnout for sure, especially starting off in those local news markets where you're doing like a million jobs, but also just the constant onslaught of criticism online. And especially considering you're supposed to have those accounts online, you're supposed to have a Twitter account, you're supposed to be available to people. That's often considered a requirement. I don't think newsrooms do a really good job, though, of thinking through how that requirement for a woman in the job is going to look and feel very different than that requirement for a man in the job, right? So those would be kind of the challenges I faced. So some of them generational, just the collapse of the news industry making it really difficult to find a job, but other things, more related to my sexual identity than necessarily me personally as a woman.
Thank you. Professor Hall?
Well, there are two things that maybe will be slightly different from some of the things, just to add a couple of things. One is when I was covering entertainment people, business and entertainment people for at the broadcast networks. I sometimes would encounter, not with the news people, but when I was, and I didn't really particularly care for covering the corporate types, but I had to sometimes. And I think one thing that is a challenge sometimes as a woman, or certainly was, the idea that this was an industry, and I think politics is too, a lot of things where you went to lunch with people, you were supposed to have drinks with people. I think the rules have really changed on that. I don't remember having a lot of drinks. I do remember, and I'll tell you, this is a comical story because it was kind of comical. There was a man that I would have lunch with who was an executive, and he would inevitably kind of play kneesies with me under the table. And I would get to the restaurant and ask them to give us a table because I didn't want this to happen again. And I never said, leave me alone, because that would have been really bizarre. This is the one thing that I had that, in a way it's funny and in a way it's bizarre. He would inevitably come in and say, oh no, we need the banquette, this very fancy New York restaurant. So, and the thing is, I never called him on it. I just would kind of try to move away, and it seemed fairly harmless. It's the only thing I remember where somebody did that. But I do think the reason I raise that is that a lot of journalism used to be pretty social. And I think, the idea that you can't go out, and people used to talk about in the corporate world that you can't go play golf. I don't think journalists play golf, but I do think journalists drink, and I do think journalists go to lunch, and not as much anymore because everybody's working 24/7. But I think there are challenges in terms of being mentored. I've heard that from younger women, that sometimes male bosses today do not want to, in any way violate boundaries that should be there. So that is also a challenge that I think young women may face. Amy's nodding because I think she's heard this too. The other thing I wanted to raise was, and again, I've just had some conversation with a couple of wonderful young journalists, and it struck me, female journalists, that the other thing that I think I faced that I didn't even really realize was selling people on my ideas and being discounted. When I worked for the LA Times, they were institutionally insecure about the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And they would sometimes call me and say, can you match this? And I would say, often with pride, I had that. We beat them. Read your own damn newspaper. I never said that, of course. You know, I wish, but so they were institutionally insecure, and at the same time, I think women do have still trouble getting their ideas across. I mean, that experience that they've documented where you say something in a meeting and a man says it and people go like Bill said, and you said it first. I've had that experience millions of times, including in academia. But I think having the confidence to keep coming back with an idea. Part of it was I do think that when I pitched things, I mean, that was one thing, you know, when I had beaten the Times, that was fun to talk about. But when I pitched stories, sometimes I would be ahead of the curve, honestly, a lot. And I wouldn't get assigned to the story. And then maybe it would be done by somebody else. And I've recently talked with two wonderful journalists of color, and they have talked about this. I don't know if it adds to the fact that they are a person of color in the newsroom, but getting the bosses who still tend to be more men to hear you, and also having the internal confidence. You know, I think part of it is the way I was acculturated. I probably said the story somewhat tentatively. And if I got turned down, you know, I think I might have taken that to heart and thought it was a bad idea, not they weren't listening. So that to me is something I've really been thinking about when I was thinking about talking to you all, because I think it's still an issue for women, not being heard, but also coming back and saying, I want to, you know, let me try that out again. Let me repitch it. I do think that's something I would really strongly say is an obstacle still.
Sure, I completely agree. I think that it's hard for a lot of female journalists to find their voice. Do you think that if a situation like when you said the gentleman was playing these under the table with you, do you think
one funny example of this, but yeah.
Or do you think that if that were to happen today, that you would
What I would do?
What you would do or what you would say to someone that is experienced?
Well, you know, I only tell that on myself because I think I didn't know what to do. You know, and it wasn't it you know, again, it wasn't anything. I mean, it's I never knew about Amy and the Male Stripper, but but I mean, it seemed harmless. Relatively, it was more annoying than anything else. He wasn't, you know, horrible or anything. It just was this weird little game of, you know, it's like women in the past used to talk about being chased around the table, metaphorically, like that wonderful movie 9 to 5, you know, that Dolly Parton and Jane Fonda were in. I don't mean it was harmless, but I guess I might have said, you know, let's stick to business. I do think you have to have a couple of lines. Amy can maybe speak to that. You know, if somebody says something that sexualizes you, you can say, you know, you can ignore it. I mean, there are various strategies. But I think it's more how ingrown some of this can be. You know, how you have accepted it. One has accepted being discounted.
Sure. Professor Eisman, did you want to add to that?
Well, before the end of the call or later, I will send some resources that the Parashift Project out of the Freedom Forum has put together in terms of helping young women or helping interns. They work to get rid of gender and race discrimination in the workplace. And so I can send out some resources and some language that people use. But something that Jane said, I hear from young people all the time, and I'm also confounded by it a little bit. Women tend to say, and I have lots, like all the professors here, talk to students all the time about negotiations, salary negotiations, job interviews. And I'm still surprised how often young women will say, I'm sorry, but I'm sorry I'm interrupting you, but I'm sorry I'm asking you this question again, but. And I'm sure I've done it myself. I might have even done it here, but it's something that men don't do. I don't know if Jane, if it was you or it was with another colleague. All of us as faculty members get requests all the time for interviews constantly. And on any topic, what comes up. Some people, often male professors, will just say yes, okay. They might not know about the topic and then they'll go look it up. And we think, well, do I know enough about that topic to talk about it? And those kind of self-imposed restrictions that we put on ourselves are something I hope that the students in the audience on this call don't feel. If you do feel it, fake it till you make it. Just pretend you're somebody else at that moment, just to get yourself out of it. I'm not talking about sexual harassment in the office. I'm talking about a lack of confidence. People, when they see a lack of confidence, will drive a truck right through it. And so the best thing you can do is, you don't have to be overly aggressive, which is not the word I want to even put into this conversation. You don't have to be anything that you're not. You just have to know that you're right. You have to know that you've been hired because of your perspective as a young person or a person of color or a woman, any of those things. As somebody with a college experience, they want you for those reasons in that newsroom or as a freelancer. They want you for that. So don't hold back. Find your voice in terms of exactly what Jane's talking about, how to talk about yourself in the newsroom.
Sure, thank you. We really appreciate your valuable input. The next question we wanted to ask was a little bit about the work that you all have done. We wanted to ask what your favorite story is that you've worked on and why. Professor Cox, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, Devin sent me the list of questions and I saw that and I thought, oh boy, this is really hard because honestly, I've been extraordinarily lucky in the range of things that I've been able to cover over time. So as much as I'm a political nerd and I loved being a Washington reporter for the many years that I was a Washington reporter covering the range of things, I think collectively, my favorite stories were my experiences covering Olympics. I'm a big sports fan anyway. Olympic sports aren't exactly the traditional kinds of sports that you think about when you think about being a sports fan, but I was able to cover 4 different Olympics. One of them wound up being more of a news story than a sports story because it was Atlanta when the Centennial Park bomb went off. Right at the outset of the games. I don't think they'd even started the competition. And that colored the experience that we all had for days. Yes, there were sporting events that we had to cover, but there was this other thing that happened. So I think collectively, probably my Olympics experience, but there are lots of other things too, too many to mention.
Thank you. Professor Foster?
Yeah, you would think some of my favorite stories would be the brewery reviews or restaurant reviews that I did as a freelancer, but they're not. I think my favorite story that I got a chance to work on was actually a feature piece about a family that was trying to get their like great-great-grand uncle his home on the stop of, so throughout the Mississippi Delta, which includes parts of Arkansas and Mississippi, um, there's a blues tour, like to kind of give you an idea of where the blues as a form of music developed and who were the important people along the way. And they found out that they had an uncle who was actually a pioneer in blues music. He went by the alias Petey Wheatstraw, the devil's son-in-law. That was his alias. And so they had no idea because the uncle was estranged. The family kicked him out for playing devil music. They didn't want him around. So they had no idea that they had this uncle until much later in their lives when they were swapping stories with a grandmother and she talked about him. And so they were really excited to try and get his home or some kind of a plaque or something in Cotton Plan, Arkansas, to kind of commemorate him. So it was a really fun story to kind of get into, not just, the history and the family history and a little bit of blues history, because like I said, I was a music major, so that was exciting. But also to kind of get into the politics of heritage, and how these heritage sites are picked and who gets to do those decisions. That was really interesting. And it was something that I had not really ever thought about until I did that story. So
That sounds very interesting. Thank you. Professor Mathur?
So I've covered, I guess, boring issues like pensions and taxes and healthcare. So I don't want to bore you with my interesting stories that I covered, but the one that is very close to my heart is my very first story with that, going back to that Indian newspaper where I was editing matrimonial ads. I insisted on being sent out on a real assignment, and this was at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. There was a group of people, Indians, who were having a meeting, 500, 600 people, and they were talking about separating from India, a separatist group. And I thought, I really want to do this. And so the editor finally said, okay, go ahead. And so he sent a male photographer with me. And I went excited. And the minute I entered the room, everybody thought that the male photographer was a reporter. And so they introduced all the men, mostly men were there, and they were introducing themselves to him and, what paper he worked for. So I had to repeatedly say, okay, it's me, I'm the reporter here. And so I had my little cassette tape recorder. I think you guys still use that. I don't know. It was a little, cassette tape recorder that I had, and I was taking notes, and I was, and the cameraman was clicking away, taking pictures, and all of a sudden, this meeting turned into a big fight, and people were arguing. It was a heated argument. Chairs were tipped over. They were, almost coming to blows. And I thought, what a great story. So I went around interviewing everybody. Cameraman is taking pictures. And all of a sudden, one of the organizers took my tape recorder away. And he said, we're not going to allow you to print this story. And took my cassette, took the tape out, took it from me. And I was like, I didn't know what to do. It's my first story. And then the cameraman, was still taking pictures, and they surrounded him and said, no, you can't take these pictures. And so they went and took his camera. And so the funniest thing was that they took the camera and then they opened the shutter, and they realized there was no film in that camera. And so I was so embarrassed. This is complete, it was so devastating. So anyway, no film, nothing. And so we ran back to the office, and I was really scared of telling this editor, who had a tendency to throw things across the room when he got mad. And so, we explained the situation, and he just laughed. I think it was the first time I heard him laugh. So he said, okay, that's fine. You have your notes. And I took copious notes. And I sat down and I wrote this story from my heart, everything that went on. And we called the organizers and said, you have to send us some pictures. We sent the tape back too. Too bad they couldn't recreate the fight scenes, but we were just, so it became a front page spread, big news about this thing at the Waldorf Astoria. And so no matter whatever I covered after that, this was the one story that is really close to my heart, and my favorite story that I actually tell my students and bore them with this.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. That is a wonderful story. Professor Hall?
Well, it's funny. I was looking at the questions, and I have to say, I mean, I think one of my favorite stories. I'm going to cheat. When I was at the LA Times, I was covering the creation of and the pressure to create a children's television movie style rating system, and also to provide educational programming. And I felt that my stories had real impact, because at the time the networks were counting the Jetsons as educational programming. This is true. And I was all over that story, and I was on the front page of the LA Times because the movie studios were involved and they were really mad about my coverage. And the head of the Motion Picture Academy demanded a meeting in the DC Bureau of the LA Times to tell us the error of my ways. I was coming down from New York and covering, congressional hearings that John McCain was chairing, and it was very heady stuff, and I felt I really had impact. So that's probably my favorite series. But I have to be honest that when I did that thing, what came to mind was getting to interview Katharine Hepburn, the great movie actress. And I'm not even sure how many young people know much about her anymore. But I had a time where I worked at People magazine and profiled news people primarily, but I had the ability to get her phone number, and she was in a television movie, and she was somebody I really admired, and I called her and she said, "Call me Tuesday." I told Amy this story, and I was like, and I called her back on Tuesday and she said, "Come on over." She had this very tremulous voice, and I said, "Now?" And she said, "Move it, life is short." She was 80 years old. "Move it, life is short." So I grabbed the famous photographer who knew her and went over, and he had so scared me, not literally, but he said, "Don't you dare ask her a question while I'm interviewing." Unfortunately, I'd read everything there was to read about her. You know, she was a great reason this is relevant. I guess maybe that's why I thought of this with you all, is she was a tremendous pioneer for women, for strong women in movies, which again really matters. You know, I think movies maybe matter less now than they used to, but she was strong. She wore pants. She lived her own life. You know, she had this tragic love affair. She had quite a life. Anyway, I just remember that she said, "Come on over," and then that he said to me, and that's not how I got the story. He came in on the fact that I got her to do this interview, but he said, "Don't ask her anything because she'll be looking at you, not me." And she finally turned to me and said, "Dear, don't you have any questions?" I've been so like, and I did. And it was a wonderful moment. You know, I felt I met one of the great women of our time. I guess probably interviewing women journalists. I'm mentioning way too many things, but I wrote an early piece on Christiane Amanpour when she was doing extraordinary work in Bosnia, put Bosnia and the war in Bosnia and the genocide there on the agenda. And I guess, you know, I've mentioned too many things, but a lot of things have been fun. Profiles have been fun. Hard news has been fun.
Thank you for sharing. We really appreciate it. Professor Eisman?
Well, first, before I forget, I want to share this resource about how to, some tips for internships when you're in the newsroom. Couple quick things. Jane, I think we ought to call this session "She Wore Pants." It's just a kind of a great title for the whole thing.
That's kind of funny.
I'm not as interesting as my colleagues here because I was an editor for most of my career. I feel still like I am one now. In my 20s, I started becoming an editor. I did some editing at this little weekly newspaper, and then from Baltimore News America to the Dallas Times Herald to USA Today to USA Weekend to AOL. Most of my career really was as an editor. But thinking back, you do think as a reporter the things that stay with you. And probably, and we mentioned it a little bit in the intro, probably one that has resonance with me is I was assigned in Baltimore to cover the family of their son was being held hostage during the Iran hostage crisis, as it was called at the time, around 79, 80, I don't remember exact year. And I spent a lot of time with them. I actually moved in with them for a while, and up in when they moved to Memphis, I moved in and stayed in their home. In those days, you guys, I'm going to show it the age now, but you didn't have cell phones. So when I needed to file my story, I had to get in my rental car and drive to a payphone, put some coins in it, and call my story in from my payphone. Those were the old days. And the family used to say to me, "You're with us all the time. Why are you going somewhere to file your story, we know everything. And I said, well, just give you some privacies. You have to hear what I'm saying about you as I'm writing about you. I think my lesson with that, and my lesson with all stories that I had the opportunity either to edit or to report, is people want to tell their stories. We think they don't. We think they don't. We don't want to walk up to somebody. There's new ways to walk up to somebody. There's ways we already see that people shouldn't be walking up to people in Boulder, Colorado, or in Atlanta. But there are ways that people do want to tell their stories a lot of times. And in fact, there's a very American experience of people want their loved ones who were lost to have some meaning, both by sharing their stories or maybe sharing something that could change things for the future for other people. And so don't necessarily turn yourself off to thinking, well, I don't want to interrupt them. I don't want to hurt them. That you have those feelings is fabulous. That makes you human. And you've got to be a human being when you're approaching people. That is it. You're a human first. When they trust you, then you can live in their house with them and write about them and their plaid pants. That's the only thing they ever complained, that I said that their pants were plaid. That was the only thing. I wrote about them for weeks and weeks. And if people trust you, and you have to earn that trust with them when you're interviewing them. And I'm going way back, and again, my colleagues here will be much more current about this, but if somebody trusts you, they'll tell you their story. And you can say things to them. Do you mean this? Is this what you're saying? And with real people, as we like to call them, real humans, as opposed to, you don't have to give this kind of room to politicians who are more practiced at what to say to you than you are in hearing it. Trust us. Vandana knows this better than anybody. They've usually got something in their back pocket. They know exactly what they're going to say, and they've already talked about it with everybody in their conference about what they're going to say. But when you're interviewing real people, they want to talk to you. They want their story to be told. They don't want to talk to somebody who's going to do a drive-by interview. And what by that I mean, hi, how do you feel is still the worst question. If you watch people, I'm still a fan of some things on CNN, and I liked the fact that Anderson Cooper decided not to say the names of shooters. We've been talking about this a lot in class lately. You don't want to, give people that much of a platform. I like some of it. He actually asks people questions after traumas. If you listen to it in a powerful way, he doesn't say, how do you feel? He say, what happened? Where were you? What were you thinking at that moment? Which are all not how do you feel. The answer to how you feel is, I feel horrible. This is trauma. Whatever has just happened to me. Well, I didn't even have words for it. But what I was doing, who I thought of, what my next step was, or tell me a story. Tell me a story. And you hear this from all your professors all the time. Tell me a story is where you want to get. Gracie, I'm sorry I went too long.
Not at all. Thank you. We appreciate it. The final question that we wanted to ask you all before we open the floor up to any other additional questions that the audience may have is, what is a piece of advice that you would want to give to a young female journalist or any of the student journalists on this call that you think would be valuable before going into the field? Professor Cox, will you start us off?
Sure. Gosh, I have a whole lot of things that I'd like to share, but I'll try to narrow it down to a couple of things. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there and make a mistake. Most of us who've done this for any period of time have made mistakes, and under the best possible circumstances, you learn something every time that happens. So you pick yourself up and you move forward, hopefully with additional ammunition to take on the next challenge that you face. Set high goals. You can grow into the shoes that you want to fill. Most of us didn't start where we wanted to end up. Some of us didn't even know where we wanted to end up. I certainly didn't. But along the way, I identified a range of things that I wanted to do, and I worked hard. And that's what you need to do. You need to work really hard. I mentioned this before, I will repeat it. Show up earlier, stay later, and overperform in almost everything that you do. One circumstance, and find mentors. I didn't have a lot of women who I could look to mentor in my earliest days. I got lucky when I came to Washington to work for UPI, so long ago. This is back when UPI actually existed. And I finally was in a place where I could look to women who could be my mentors. And it was the best thing that could have happened to me ever. And I had the best woman mentor in the person of Helen Thomas. That name may not mean a lot to a lot of the people in the room, but look her up. She is an institution and she is a piece of history. And I feel so fortunate that I was able to have her as a mentor. Very important. Find people who you can spend time with and learn from. Also, be optimistic. You're coming into the universe of journalism at a time when it's more likely that the person who is hiring in a newsroom may actually be a woman. Didn't used to be that way. And it doesn't matter if it's in journalism or if it's in any other field. The people who are in position to hire other people tend to hire people who look like them. It's different a little bit now because we're obviously living in a time when the sensitivities are far greater than they were when I was coming up in the business. But you are likely to enter a newsroom where there will not only be other women around, there may be more women than there are men in the newsroom. Look around you when you go to class. Or when you go to a Zoom call for a class or whatever it happens to be these days, there are more women in the room than there are men these days. So the women are emerging from journalism schools, and this tends to be the pipeline that's going to produce the next generation of people in newsrooms. So the odds are good that you will have more women in the room, and maybe a woman could be the one to hire you to do whatever it is that you aim to do or are able to do as you get yourself started. But be optimistic, work hard, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. I said it all. Sorry, multiple times.
Sure, thank you, Professor Hall.
Gee, I think I should just, I think you said it all. I really do. I think I would, what can I don't know that I can even add to that. I mean, the one thing that obviously is on my mind when I thought of talking to a group of young women was the thing I raised about having confidence in yourself and having confidence in your ideas. I do think that what Professor Cox has said is really true. I do think, and this, this gets into this funny gender thing. I do think women like to help other women, want to help other women. I do think the fact that there are more women also changes the dynamic. You're not the first, you're not the only of whatever that is, which is what a lot of women in leadership. I also hope some of you all go into leadership the way Amy did. I think that's important. I personally think probably wouldn't be as much fun, but I think it's really important. I think that we are at a really exciting time. I do feel that news organizations do want to improve their coverage, do want to represent more voices. I mean, I will say that I've also heard that it can be a struggle. I mean, some of the reporters who are reporters of color have talked about how they don't feel that they were heard. I mean, this is obviously their ideas weren't heard or their community. But now I think, I mean, the tragedy in Atlanta, for example, I mean, nothing has shown how, I mean, rarely have I seen anything that showed the ignorance, the malicious, I mean, the extraordinary ignorance of the officials, and also the hesitation of the news media to cover a story until the tragedy struck, frankly. And I don't mean ever and never. There were stories, but what that revealed, I think, has got to lead to some soul searching among people in the media about, well, why didn't we do more? Why haven't we had people who would understand that? I mean, there's a story I've been told by my students today that there's a story about the grieving process in the Washington Post in the Asian American community, that somebody who's of that community is probably the person who should be writing that and might be the only representative who could be writing that story. So I do think there's a push. Corporations do better when there's more diversity. That's a proven fact. When they have more women on their boards, they do better. And I do think women still are a little bit more collegial by nature. And I do think women are still apologetic. When I was doing a forum some years ago, I was asking, I would have women tell me they didn't know enough to be on the panel. I've done that myself, when I'm an expert on something. And I've worked to really notice that and point that out to my women students. They still do that. I'm sorry, or I don't know if this is what you want, but it's a conversational tick, apparently, according to Deborah Tannen. It's partially because we aren't as strong physically. It has some historical basis. Did you know this, Amy? That it's partially a way of creating a safety zone and a consensus, apparently, to get people on board with you, to sort of build in consensus. But I see that disappearing, but I still get it from women students. And I think it is something. I feel as if I've focused on this a great deal because I've been thinking about what I would want to tell you. The fact is the structures themselves need to change. And that's the other part. It's not up to you. You can be as confident as all get out. And if there are no men who will listen to you, or if they're all men, the structures of journalism do need to change. It's not all on you all. You should not have to be harassed. You should not have to come up with lines to deflect harassment. They need to change. So I don't want you to leave with anything other than that message. But I do think a lot is you will be met with obstacles, but there is an openness right now. That's how I feel. Amy, you talk to employers more than I do, but I do think there's a sense that this is a time to deal with things that have not been dealt with. Do you think so? I'm kind of turning to you because I know you talk to employers a lot.
Yes. The challenges of the newsrooms are front and center. And the reason we all know about it is because they write about it all the time. It's not even secret. And the media reporters like Jane they know all these things that are happening. So I agree with you, Jane.
Sure. Thank you. And Professor Eisman, we'll go ahead and transition to you if that's okay.
Sure. Like a manager, I wrote down my tips list just to tell you guys. One is be yourself. You got to be yourself. You got to be yourself. Don't be somebody else. Because it's not going to work. You can get stuck in it. And you have to, and sometimes it doesn't fit necessarily the culture, but realize that everybody in the culture feels a little bit different than everybody else. And so you're kind of not alone. I like the idea of finding mentors, and I like the idea of finding allies. Play to your strength. If you're really good at something, get it out there first. Make sure that everybody knows. I'm going to give Bobbie that story because Bobbie is an expert on data journalism. And Bobbie's proven it to me, and so I'm going to give her a few more on that. So play to your strengths, at least in the beginning when you get to a place. This, I heard from someone else, I've been saying it so long, I pretend that I said it, but it's careers are a jungle gym and not a ladder. You guys are going to be popping around a whole lot more than we did. And it means that you're going to be gathering up skill sets in your pockets as you go along. That's good. I think your professors will say, we don't really want you to leave anywhere after a year or so. We would like you to kind of invest in a place. But it is okay to continue to look for how you can further your career. And a whole nother time, we can do a management session at a different time, and we can talk about how to do that. And the last one is kind of personal. Don't marry your job. Try to find the work-life balance. Try to find the opportunity to make the rest of your life offer as many things as your job does. I can't speak for the other people, but journalism is adrenaline. It is, wow, this is amazing. You know, I get to talk to these people, I get to be at this place, or I get to see this, or and you can just kind of go all the time doing it. You really can. And so what I actually admire more about your all's generation than mine is that you know that. I hear a lot of people talking about self-care. I hear a lot of people talking about physical safety. I hear a lot of people talking about finding time to breathe and be yourself. So important. So I'd like you to continue to have that passion. Nothing's going to get away from you. You all, the fact that you're here tonight during a pandemic, in the middle of the semester, on Zoom, shows that you've already got what it takes. You already are saying, how can I, what can I do to get myself to the next step? You're done. You've done it. You're there. So now all you have to do is get yourself in the door, keep that confidence, and be yourself.
That is excellent advice. Thank you. Professor Foster?
Sure. I would probably echo some of the things that everybody said here, confidence and, the work-life balance thing is definitely something that is really important. To add to that, I would say having a really great support system, not just in a newsroom or where you're working, but outside of it. You need to have people that you don't work with, that you have beers with or talk to, about not work-related things on occasion. And this can be a really traumatic job. You see a lot of terrible stuff. You talk to people sometimes in the worst times of their lives, sometimes in the best times of their lives, and that can affect you as you're doing the job. So you need to have a good support system of people around you who can recognize when you're struggling or when you might be having a hard time with something, because I know newsrooms have not traditionally been a great, resource for helping reporters deal with some of that stuff. So it's really important for you to kind of get a good support system around you that can help you through some of those rougher patches in something that you've covered or in, jumping back and forth between jobs. I think that's really important. I would also say that don't be surprised if things in your life that were not originally related to journalism don't come in handy in the job. When I was a college student and covering game and fish in Arkansas, those guys were like, "Who's this 19-year-old little girl calling us?" But I grew up on a farm and I talked the talk, right? So it didn't take long for them to realize that I wasn't just asking them sort of questions that were uninformed. I was asking them questions from a position of somebody who had been out and seen things and done things and understood what they were talking about and what I could get at that would be more informative to my readers. So you would be surprised where you grew up, who you grew up around, just even your hobbies, things that you have an interest in outside of journalism might come into play and help you out on a story or help you out, just in general, making connections and networking with people too. So.
Sure, it's very valuable advice. Thank you. Professor Mathur?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. Networking and being good at what you do, so all those things are really great advice. I might just add one thing, is when you're reporting, look for diversity in your sources, people that you talk to for stories. This is one thing that we at Bloomberg are really actually having training sessions with reporters to teach them that not to call the same 5 or 6 people that they usually do for a story. Because, for instance, our readers are a lot of times, in the corporate world, they're men, they're, lobbyists and attorneys, and they happen to be men who raise their hand first and say, yes, I can comment on that. And so the reporters get stuck covering the same 12 people. And so we're making it a requirement to make sure that you talk to a diverse group of people, you talk to minorities, and include their points of view in any story that you cover. It's important to also cover minority issues. Anything that you cover, there are always minority issues out there, a point of view that's not been reported on. And so that's, that I feel that is very important. We're not only committed to, ending, discrimination and hiring more minority reporters, we want to reflect that, that diversity in our writing. And so that's the only thing I'll add to all the other excellent suggestions that were made here.
Sure. Thank you for your suggestions. And thank you to all the professors that have been able to provide your invaluable advice and support so far. With that, I'm going to transfer it over to Riddy, and we're going to open the floor to some other questions.
Rudy, can I put one more resource up here?
Of course.
The other day, one of my colleagues and I did a presentation for the college media advisors. And the reason I put this here is there are 3 AU alums who put together a new podcast. The podcast address is in there. It's called Journeys to Journalism, and it's about looking for a job. And they're all in their first job. And so it's their advice and it's a podcast the link is in there. It's kind of worth checking it out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to kick things off with audience questions actually, I'm really glad you shared that podcast because we do have a question about jobs coming up. But our first question from the audience is, because of the coronavirus pandemic, many parts of our daily routine have been moved online and it's harder to make personal connections. How can young female journalists go about making connections with professors, coworkers, mentors, or bosses when they can't actually meet with them face to face? And I'm going to kick things off with Professor Mathur, if that's all right.
Well, yeah, I know it's too bad that we can only communicate through Zoom. And in our office, what we've done is set aside time for just chats, not talk about work, just have a social chat, like a coffee get together. We have happy hours, with our reporters, where we are all just sitting there talking about, what we did this week and, what's on our minds. So yes, it's very hard for young reporters, especially if you're, brand new in the office, to have that connection. And it's something, unfortunately, that we have to deal with. But I do think that getting away from work a little bit, and talking just about to people, asking them how they're doing, it could really make the difference. And we do these things weekly. And happy hours we do, like, maybe once a month. So that's unfortunately is the only way I see to help out young reporters who haven't gone to the office in years, and in a year. And I think that's the only way, unfortunately.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, Rudy.
Go for it.
This is something a young journalist who spoke in my class said, and that she'd been asking because she's new in a beat, and she said she'd been asking people to have virtual coffee with her to try to develop some sources or further develop some sources. And she said people laugh and then they agree, usually. So I throw that out as an idea that sounded like a good one to me, because you do need to meet people, not in a formal setting, so that you can establish some rapport.
Yeah. Professor Cox, did you have any ideas for this as well?
What's been said already by Professor Mathur and Professor Hall is absolutely on point. The one thing that I would say that isn't exactly about meeting your sources, I mean, what's been said addresses that. But I think an element of that is that one of the things that's really important that's missing from today's newsroom environment is that you're not in the same physical space with your colleagues. And there cannot be too much that I could say about the benefit and the value of being together in a room with other people who are pursuing journalism, who can share their experiences, who can give advice, who can, provide suggestions and guidance and whatever, just commiserate. And I think it's important to maintain as much of a connection as possible with your colleagues, who then in turn can perhaps suggest ways that they're finding success in meeting people. It is important to have conversations other than the conversation that you have when you're interviewing somebody for a story. Because as was said before, establishing trust with the people who you're talking with is critically important if you're going to get to the information that you need to tell their story. And we're all challenged now about the ways that we used to do this kind of thing. So we have to make do with what we have. Zoom, FaceTime, messaging, Slack, and other things like that. Any sort of, thank God we have the technology that allows us to do this. For some of us in the earlier days, there wasn't anything like this. You could pick up a phone or you could go to see them, and that was it. At least we have opportunities beyond the phone and the physical space.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, speaking from as someone who's doing all of her classes from India, I can say technology has definitely been essential, if not helpful. Professor Eisman, did you have any advice on this in terms of for young reporters or for students?
If you get a chance to buzz through that PowerPoint, it had to do with navigating your interviews and your first jobs. And it also has a really good section in it from my colleague, Jeremiah Patterson, about how to build a portfolio, because how you put yourself across digitally is going to be fairly important. One of the pieces of advice in there is from a guy named Theodore Kim. He is the head of early career recruiting and fellowships and internships at the New York Times. And he said, use this time when you might have to lower your expectations a little bit, but use this time to get your portfolio and your resume and your clips together. Don't wait until you have a job and then you have to suddenly throw everything together to make it look good. And he also said something long-term it's hard to think long-term when we're sitting in this seat and kind of, it's March and April and figuring out where we are. He said, you might not get that job now, but you want to build that relationship. So I love the fact, and I know all the professors are the same way, and I know Professor Hall and I do this because we share these with each other all the time. People tell us where their careers are progressing and what's going on, and they'll send us a clip of, look what I did. And it's so important to keep that networking, but it's not networking in a fake way. It's to keep that relationship going. Even if you're looking for your first job and you might not get that one that you might have wanted, and I'm just saying you might not want the New York Times, or you might, but you get yourself in front of the person, and then that person sees how you've developed over the last 6 months to a year. Oh, by the way, I didn't get my fellowship with you, but I went here, and here are some things that I've done. So keeping in touch is really important. And the last thing is, you don't know what direction you're going to go in. There's a graphic. Oh, I'm going to do a terrible job. That's the graphic. This is time, and this is your skills and your desires. If you pick something where your location and your skills and your desires, it's going to take you longer to get because you have oh, this is terrible, isn't that? Okay, so it doesn't matter. It's going to take you a longer time to get to the perfect job. It's going to be a shorter time if you can use fewer skill sets, and maybe you want to give up on the location. One of the things that always surprises me when I'm talking to students and they're looking at their jobs is they say, I don't know if I want to live in New York. And then I always say, have you been offered the job? Well, no, but I don't know if I'm.
Oh, yeah.
That one, just don't close doors that aren't open. So keep all your options open. Learn from even a job interview that you might not want might mean the person says, oh, I met Marissa and she was so cool and I don't have the job, but by the way, I just talked to this great person the other day and I hear that you have one. You never know how these things connect. And sometimes it's really just great practice. It's just great practice to go through it. It's hard. You're putting yourself out there. We know that. It's, we interview people all the time. It is not easy. And the good part about it is you can tell during the interview what the place is going to be like when you go to work there. If Vandana interviewed me, I couldn't wait to go work at Bloomberg because she's got a calm manner. She asks questions. She listens really well. If you're doing an interview and somebody's not doing any of those things, truth is, you don't really want to go there because that's the way it's going to be.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing. Professor Foster, would you be willing to offer your input on this?
Yeah, I don't really have much to add that hasn't already been said. I think trying out the virtual coffee idea is good, not just for sources, but also for people who work in a newsroom you're interested in. I mean, it's advice that I give people who are interested in applying to graduate school or wherever they're applying. Maybe don't start with the boss, reach out to somebody who works there and ask them, what is it like to work there? Do you like your job? Is it terrible? That's also how you're going to get a lot of that unofficial information that's not on the brochure, right? That's not going to be what's advertised, but you'll actually get a feel for what the environment's like. So I think reaching out to people in places that you want to work, who maybe are not at the top, but just talking to them about what it's like to work there, and trying to make those connections too, but also reaching out to people and just saying, do you have, 30 minutes, an hour to just sit down and chat with me, and send them a link. It's really difficult right now, especially, I know, but it's worth a shot to try, just to reach out to people. And you'd be surprised how many people are actually really friendly and excited to talk to somebody. When I first decided to study internet memes, the leading researcher in that was living in Israel, and she had published a book and a ton of articles, and I assumed when I reached out to her as an undergraduate thinking about this that she would not have any time for me, but she answered me back and talked to me and gave me a whole bunch of information. She really didn't have to do that, but a lot of people they may seem intimidating, but they're actually willing to help you out. So it never hurts to just send an email, I would say.
Thank you so much. I know you touched upon this, and Professor Eisman has as well. I'm going to reframe this question just a little bit. So we had one question asking for advice on networking and effective networking strategies in regards to getting internships or jobs. I know you've talked a lot about how to be networking and how to reach out to people. My question is, how do you find the people to reach out to? Or how do you know who to reach out to? And this is just sort of open for anyone who has any advice on that.
I have a couple of ideas, and this is based on actual, real experience from this semester and previous semesters. I'm sure that all the professors bring speakers in to talk to their classes, and I try very hard to bring in people who represent a range of um, types of journalism and locations for journalism work and so on and so on. Almost everyone to a person is willing to communicate with students after the class is over. That's one good way to get more information from an individual about an organization or about their work in general. Use the resources that the professors have available to them. All of us have established over time connections with people in the industry. We know people who we can refer you to if you're interested in an internship at ABC, for instance, or NPR, for example. Talk to the professors, ask them for their suggestions and their advice and their experiences. Don't be bashful, ask everyone. Really, I mean, the more you can gather information, the more you will be equipped to reach out and put yourself out there for the internship opportunities. We're lucky because we are both American, Maryland, George Washington, Georgetown, George Mason, name a university in the area. We have so many internship opportunities that are available to students here. It's a gold mine. And the students, generally speaking, are able to take advantage of that. So utilize all the resources that are potentially available. Your professors, the speakers in classes, and other professors at the universities who you get to know.
Absolutely. I know from a lot of my classes, especially with Professor Hall and Professor Eisman this semester, a lot of the speakers that come and speak to our classes do drop their email at the end. So it's very helpful to have that information. Is there anyone else with any thoughts on this?
I don't know about Maryland, but one obvious thing is to, if there is a place where you want to work, to look up and see if there are alums from your program who are working there. And you can find that on Facebook and on LinkedIn. You can do searches, and The other thing, there's some fellowships, and a lot of news organizations have created fellowships that, in some ways, I'm a little, I'm not, I'm not as crazy about these. Some of these are like a year-long job trial, and I kind of object to that in a way. And thousands of people apply to some of these things. I would look. I had a professor once who said, "Take your eye off the ball." As a journalist, which I absolutely love. Like if 21,000 people are applying to NPR for an internship, and your school does have a way in on that, or people there, or a tradition there, that's one thing. But you can also find some place that you might create something. You might go to them and see what you can offer them, if it's a place you really want to be. And the other thing is, this is again very obvious, but know the place that you want to apply. If you want to pitch a freelance article, I've noticed, I guess because of the pandemic, students are more interested in finding out more about freelancing, which really doesn't pay very well, but can be a way in on a place. And you need to know what they do, what they've done, so you can kind of job search and freelance in a way. Those are sort of the same thing. I would definitely try to find somebody at a place. Going over the transom, as we call it, can be very discouraging. The newsletter that Mandy Hofmichael does often. Do you guys know about that newsletter? You want to put that in the chat? She has.
The address is in the PowerPoint.
It's called Jobs and My Dog.
Journalism Jobs. Yeah, and she has pictures of her dog, but the address is in that PowerPoint link that I threw up there.
So I think I've certainly touted that because often she will have a person who tweeted about the job, and then if you're smart, which you guys all are, you can use that and then reach out to that person and say, whom should I contact? Or maybe they're the person you should be contacting. I do know it can be very discouraging to students. I do think there are algorithms that kick people out, and you never get heard. You never get seen. For some job that says 2 years job experience, you're not going to even get past human resources. If you know somebody, you might be able to go around. I think the same thing is true of internships. I don't know, Amy, you agree on that? And Merrillee, I don't know about your internship program. I know that there are internships that we almost pass down from one student to the next, right? If we're lucky. They've hired our students and they love our students, or they want to hire our students, or they're an alum of our program. I mean, I do think when you use the word gold mine, I mean, DC is quite special in that way. I think better than New York, better than being in school. I think DC is, if you're interested in policy and the kinds of things that are here, there are a lot of opportunities.
And I have signed up for that newsletter, and I can say that it's very helpful, not just for jobs, but also there's an internship section at the end. And that's helped me while I've been looking for internships for the summer. But thank you so much. Is there anything else that anyone would like to say before we wrap up our panel for the day? Well, thank you so much for being here and for speaking with us. I'm just going to hand it off to Hannah. But again, really thank you. We really appreciate your time and your valuable input.
Thank you.
Good luck to you guys.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining. We just wanted to extend our sincerest gratitude to you guys for taking time out of your busy schedules to talk to us. And then just to add a little note to the end of that last question that about networking, if you guys all join the Her Campus Nationals LinkedIn, you can usually find a lot of really cool opportunities with Her Campus Nationals and Her Campus chapter networks. So if you wanted to pursue journalism within Her Campus, they also have a lot of really cool opportunities. We just wanted to thank everyone who came tonight, and we were really excited about this collaboration between Her Campus at American and Her Campus at University of Maryland. We've been wanting to do a collab for a really long time. So thank you guys so much for taking the time to speak with us.